Jim, your newspaper has been looking at a lot of the particulars of what might be involved in this pretty gloomy statement we're seeing ahead. What would you say is nailed on as some of those proposals, some of those policies that will be being brought forward from 11:30 this morning?
So what we should expect is £30 billion of spending cuts to public expenditure, and we should expect about £24 billion in tax rises. So to go through the spending cuts, I think it's nailed on that there will be a further reduction in foreign aid. The existing cut to 0.5% of GDP will continue for another 2 years to about 2028. I think in terms of other cuts in expenditure, we're going to see squeezes on most departments. There could be ring fencing to health, for example. But I think across the board, we'll see these cuts. But the interesting thing about them is that for the first couple of years, Rishi Sunak and Jeremy Hunt will maintain the spending increases of about 2% that they inherited from the previous government. But then they pencil in a real tightening from about 2024 onwards, and basically real terms freeze. But what that is, it's kind of a political trap for Labour, because who knows who'll be in power then. It may not be the Conservative Party, and the question then goes to Labour: what would you do? Would you squeeze public expenditure? And if you're not going to do that, are you going to put up taxes instead? So in terms of the tax rises that we're going to see today from Jeremy Hunt in the House of Commons over there, I think we're going to see the existing oil and gas windfall tax is going to be expanded for another 2 years. The rate is going to be increased from 25% to 35%. I think it's going to be extended to electricity producers. And so a windfall tax that the public don't seem to know about, because Liz Truss liked to pretend it didn't exist, will be extended from about £28 billion to over £45 billion. But the biggest increase in tax to think about is very, very complicated. It's all about fiscal drag. They've made it complicated so people don't understand it. But Rishi Sunak last year announced a freeze in income tax thresholds, which by 2026 was already on track to raise 30 billion quid. That is equivalent to a 5p increase in the income tax. Can you imagine if these politicians said if they said openly we're putting 5p on income tax, there would be uproar. But because it's through the back door, people don't really notice. And I think Jeremy Hunt will continue to freeze those thresholds. That will raise another £5 or £10 billion, and he will freeze all sorts of other tax thresholds on things like national insurance, inheritance tax, and the pension tax relief. There'll be an awful lot of fiscal drag we're going to see.
Now, as you've been speaking, Jim, I'm told that Ben Wallace has walked out of the door to number 10. There he is, the Defence Secretary, leaving number 10 now. And Defence is a department that is really looking like it's going to be facing some chops. Gone is the ambition to raise spending on defence to 3% of GDP by the end of the decade. It looks like, other than health, all these other departments, whether it's defence, whether it's sort of all these, I suppose, foreign-focused departments, may well be getting some pretty swingeing cuts.
Yeah, and I think the defence establishment is going to be very uneasy if that does happen today. I think that the whole 3% target by 2030 was always one of those slightly tricksy targets where the question is not where we're at in 8 years' time. The question is whether you go up there gradually and have decent increases year by year, or do you restrain defence spending and then suddenly rise up to 2030 at the end of the decade? I mean, that remains to be seen. But, you know, people talk about this as being austerity part 2. I think it is going to feel quite austere. When you look at council budgets, for example, they used to get a central budget from central government in 2010 that was about £41 billion a year. That's already been cut to about £26 billion a year and could be restrained further. What that means in terms of local services, what that means for levelling up, it's basically the opposite of levelling up. It's basically taking money away from town centres, and that's one of the reasons why we're going to see the cap on local authorities putting up council tax, which at the moment is you can't put them up by more than 2.99% without a local referendum. That will be increased to 4.99%. You know, we're looking at social rents. The rents paid by people in social housing will probably go up by about 7% as well. There are so many different squeezes on people that are going to happen in this budget. And I heard what Liam was saying earlier about, you know, maybe people will get cold feet about this and think, or maybe we'd be better off doing tax cuts instead. The only problem with that is we saw what happened with Liz Truss and Kwasi Kwarteng when they tried to do that. The markets took fright, the yields on gilts went through the roof. That had terrible repercussions for the interest costs on Britain's debts. It also had terrible repercussions for people's mortgages. It just feels a bit like this government is walking along a very narrow, it's a very narrow sort of avenue under massive precipices on either side, and neither route is very easy.